The conference room went dead silent when my supervisor, Marcus, threw my design portfolio across the mahogany table like it was contaminated trash. 23 pages of architectural blueprints, 3D renderings, and structural calculations scattered across the polished surface, while 8 pairs of eyes watched my professional humiliation unfold in real time. The silence stretched so long I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead and someone's stomach growling 3 seats down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Chen, and 6 months ago, I thought I understood how the world worked. I believed that talent rose to the top, that hard work got recognized, and that merit mattered more than office politics. I was 26 years old, fresh out of graduate school with a master's in architecture, and stupid enough to think my Stanford degree would protect me from the kind of workplace cruelty that seemed like something from a different era. The portfolio that Marcus had just dismissed contained my life's work. Every late night in the studio, every recalculated stress beam, every painstaking detail that had earned me the highest GPA in my graduating class. The designs weren't just technical drawings. They were pieces of my soul translated into steel and concrete. Dreams of buildings that could change how people lived and worked and felt safe in the world. "This is amateur hour, Emma," Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension that made my teeth clench. He was leaning back in his leather chair with his arms crossed, a pose I'd seen him strike whenever he wanted to establish dominance over someone he considered beneath him. "I mean, honestly, what were you thinking with these foundation specs? And this roofline design looks like something a first-year student would submit." The worst part wasn't the criticism itself. I could handle professional feedback, even harsh critique that helped me grow. The worst part was the way he said it, like he was explaining something obvious to a child who should have known better. Like my 2 years of experience at Richardson and Associates meant nothing. Like the building science courses I'd taken, the internships I'd completed, the recommendation letters from professors who called my work exceptional, were all just participation trophies. I felt heat crawling up my neck, that familiar flush of embarrassment mixed with rage that I'd been swallowing for months. Around the table, my colleagues studied their hands or their laptops or the abstract art hanging on the far wall. Anything to avoid making eye contact with me while I got dressed down in front of the entire senior design team. Sarah from structural engineering shot me a sympathetic look, but she didn't say anything. David from urban planning cleared his throat and shifted in his chair, but his mouth stayed closed. Even Jennifer, who'd been my closest friend in the office and had seen me work on these designs for 3 weeks straight, suddenly found her phone screen fascinating. This wasn't the first time Marcus had humiliated me in front of the team, but it was definitely the most public and the most cruel. Over the past 6 months, he'd developed what seemed like a personal mission to undermine everything I did. When I suggested innovative materials for the Henderson Community Center project, he called my ideas impractical and expensive. When I stayed late to fix drainage issues on the Morrison office complex, he told the client that the problems had been caused by, quote, junior staff inexperience in the first place. "The Riverside Development Project is our biggest contract this year," Marcus continued, picking up one of my scattered blueprints and waving it dismissively. "Our client is paying us $2.8 million for a mixed-use complex that will house 300 families and 50 businesses. They're not paying for amateur architectural fantasies." He dropped the paper back onto the table with deliberate carelessness. The sound it made hitting the wood seemed amplified in the quiet room. I watched my rendering of the children's playground area land face down, the colorful illustration of kids playing on swings and slides hidden from view. "I'm reassigning the project to David's team," Marcus announced. "They have the experience and the practical mindset this kind of development requires. Emma, you can assist with basic drafting and site surveys under David's supervision." The demotion hit me like a physical blow. The Riverside development had been my project from day one. I'd spent weeks researching the neighborhood, interviewing potential residents, studying traffic patterns, and environmental impact reports. I'd designed the complex to include affordable housing units, community gardens, and small business spaces that would serve the local population instead of displacing them. Those weren't amateur ideas. They were thoughtful solutions to real urban planning challenges, backed by demographic research and sustainability studies that I'd compiled on my own time. The playground wasn't just pretty illustration. It was positioned to maximize natural light while providing parents with clear sightlines from the residential units. The community garden wasn't decorative landscaping. It was a food security initiative that could reduce grocery costs for low-income families by 30%. But Marcus saw none of that. Or maybe he saw it and didn't care. David nodded gravely when Marcus handed him my project files, already shifting into the role of responsible senior architect cleaning up a junior colleague's mess. "I'll review Emma's work and see what we can salvage," he said, his tone suggesting there wouldn't be much worth keeping. The meeting continued around me as if I'd become invisible. Marcus outlined the new timeline, discussed budget allocations, and assigned team responsibilities while I sat there, trying not to let my face show how completely devastated I felt. My project. My months of research. My innovative solutions. All of it dismissed as amateur work that needed adult supervision. When the meeting finally ended, people filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact and conversation. The room emptied until it was just me and my scattered portfolio pieces, 23 pages of rejected dreams spread across a conference table that cost more than I made in 3 months. I gathered my papers with shaking hands, trying to maintain some dignity even though I felt like crying or screaming or both. Some of the blueprints had gotten coffee stains from someone's abandoned mug. Others had footprints from people stepping around them to leave the room. My carefully formatted title pages were wrinkled and out of order. Jennifer lingered by the door after everyone else had left, her expression torn between sympathy and self-preservation. "Emma, I'm sorry," she said quietly. That was really harsh, even for Marcus. "Harsh but fair, apparently," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady as I slid my ruined portfolio into its leather case. "According to our supervisor, I'm just an amateur playing dress-up as an architect. You know that's not true. Your work is brilliant. Everyone knows it. Everyone except the person who controls my career." Jennifer glanced toward the door, making sure we were really alone. "Look, Marcus has been under a lot of pressure lately. The Riverside project is high profile, and if anything goes wrong, his head will roll. He's probably just being extra cautious." "Cautious," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Is that what we're calling sexist power trips now?" Jennifer's face went pale. "Emma, you can't say things like that. If someone hears you accusing Marcus of discrimination." "What? I'll get fired? Demoted? Publicly humiliated in front of my colleagues?" I gestured toward the empty conference room. Too late. I finished packing my portfolio and headed for the door, but Jennifer caught my arm. "Don't do anything stupid, okay? I know you're angry, but this will blow over. Just keep your head down, do good work on the assignments they give you, and prove yourself slowly." Keep my head down, prove myself slowly. The same advice I'd been following for 6 months while watching my career stagnate under Marcus's management. The same strategy that had gotten me exactly nowhere except a front row seat to my own professional humiliation. How long am I supposed to keep my head down, Jen? Another 6 months? A year? Until Marcus decides I've suffered enough to earn his respect? It's not about suffering. It's about paying your dues. David didn't have to pay dues. He got promoted to senior architect 8 months after he started here. His biggest qualification was a mediocre portfolio and the right combination of chromosomes. Jennifer released my arm and stepped back, her expression shifting from sympathy to discomfort. "That's not fair, and you know it. David has experience that you don't have. David has a penis that I don't have. Everything else is negotiable." The words hung in the air between us, too honest and too angry for the polite fiction we were supposed to maintain about workplace equality. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jennifer looked toward the door again, as if someone might have overheard my moment of brutal honesty. "I can't have this conversation with you," she said finally. "And neither can anyone else here, if you want to keep your job." She left me standing alone in the conference room with my destroyed portfolio and my shattered illusions about fairness and merit. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Seattle skyline stretching toward Elliott Bay, a forest of glass and steel towers built by architects who'd probably faced their own moments of doubt and humiliation. I wondered how many of them had been told their work was amateur. How many had been reassigned and demoted and dismissed by supervisors who saw them as threats instead of assets? How many had kept their heads down and proved themselves slowly until they forgot what it felt like to dream big? The Riverside Development Project had meant everything to me. It wasn't just another contract or another line on my resume. It was my chance to design something meaningful, something that would improve people's lives, instead of just impressing other architects. The affordable housing units I'd planned weren't just economically efficient. They were dignified homes with natural light and private outdoor space, the kind of place where families could build real lives instead of just surviving. The community spaces weren't architectural showpieces. They were gathering places designed to strengthen neighborhood connections and support local businesses. The sustainable building materials weren't trendy, eco-friendly gestures. They were long-term investments in environmental responsibility that would reduce operating costs for residents while minimizing the development's carbon footprint. Those weren't amateur ideas. They were sophisticated solutions to complex urban challenges, informed by research and guided by genuine care for the people who would actually use the spaces I designed. But Marcus had looked at my work and seen only inexperience, impracticality, and expensive fantasies. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was an amateur pretending to understand things beyond my qualifications. Maybe my Stanford education, and my professor's praise, and my research and my passion were all just elaborate self-deception. Maybe keeping my head down and proving myself slowly was the only realistic path forward. Or maybe Marcus was a mediocre architect, threatened by someone who cared more about good design than office politics. I walked back to my cubicle in the open workspace area, past the rows of drafting tables and computer stations, where junior architects hunched over CAD programs, and senior staff conducted quiet conversations about projects I wasn't important enough to join. My desk was tucked into a corner near the copy machine, a location that guaranteed frequent interruptions and zero privacy. The space reflected my status in the office hierarchy. No window view, no door to close, no room for client meetings or design conferences, just a standard issue workspace with a computer, a phone, and barely enough surface area for my drafting supplies. I'd tried to personalize it with a small plant and a few photos, but the result only emphasized how temporary and insignificant my position felt. My computer screen showed 17 new emails, most of them project updates and meeting requests that no longer applied to me. I deleted the messages about Riverside development deadlines and material specifications, watching my connection to the project disappear one email at a time. The hardest part was calling my contacts at the community organizations I'd been working with. Mrs. Rodriguez from the Riverside Neighborhood Association had been so excited about the affordable housing units and the community garden spaces. Mr. Thompson from the local business coalition had loved my plans for the ground floor commercial spaces, designed specifically to support small, locally owned shops instead of national chain stores. I'd built relationships with these people over weeks of meetings and site visits. I'd listened to their concerns, incorporated their suggestions, and earned their trust by treating their input as valuable, instead of just checking boxes for community engagement requirements. Now I had to tell them that someone else would be taking over their project, someone who might not share my commitment to their priorities. The phone calls were brief and professional, but I could hear the disappointment in their voices. Mrs. Rodriguez asked if the new architect would keep the community garden. Mr. Thompson wanted to know if the commercial spaces would still prioritize local businesses. I gave them David's contact information and promised that the new team would be in touch soon, but I couldn't promise that any of their concerns would remain priorities. "You really understood what we needed," Mrs. Rodriguez said before hanging up. "I hope the new person will care as much as you did." That comment stayed with me through the rest of the afternoon as I pretended to focus on the busy work Marcus had assigned me. Site surveys and basic drafting, tasks that required technical skill but no creative vision. Important work that needed to be done, but work that any competent architect could handle without emotional investment or innovative thinking. I measured property boundaries and calculated square footage and updated CAD files with the methodical precision of someone whose job had been reduced to data entry. The work kept my hands busy, but it couldn't quiet the thoughts racing through my mind. 6 months ago, I'd arrived at Richardson & Associates, convinced that I was starting my dream career. The firm had an excellent reputation for sustainable design and community-focused projects. Marcus had seemed impressed during my interview, praising my academic achievements and expressing enthusiasm for my research in affordable housing innovations. "We need fresh perspectives," he'd told me then. "Young architects who understand that good design can solve social problems, not just win awards." Those words had felt like validation, like proof that my values and my skills were exactly what the industry needed. I'd accepted the position with excitement and gratitude, eager to contribute to projects that mattered. The reality had been different from the first day. Marcus assigned me to assist on other people's projects instead of leading my own. When I suggested improvements or innovations, he redirected me toward more practical concerns like budget constraints and zoning regulations. When I stayed late to refine designs or research new materials, he told me I was overthinking problems that had standard solutions. "Architecture isn't about reinventing the wheel," he'd said during my 3-month review. "It's about delivering reliable results on time and on budget." But I hadn't gone to graduate school to deliver reliable results. I'd studied architecture because I believed buildings could change lives, because thoughtful design could create opportunities and solve problems and make the world more beautiful and functional and equitable. I'd chosen this career because I wanted to build things that mattered. Marcus seemed to see that passion as a liability instead of an asset. Every time I advocated for sustainable materials or inclusive design features or community input, he framed my suggestions as expensive complications that clients wouldn't appreciate. Every time I referenced research or best practices from other cities, he reminded me that theoretical knowledge meant nothing without practical experience. "You'll understand better when you've been doing this longer," became his standard response to any idea I proposed. "Right now, you need to focus on learning the basics." The basics apparently involved keeping quiet, following instructions, and accepting that innovation was reserved for architects with more experience and better judgment. The basics meant designing buildings that met minimum requirements without aspiring to anything exceptional or meaningful. I'd tried to be patient. I'd told myself that every career had growing pains, that proving myself would take time, that Marcus was probably just being cautious with an inexperienced employee. I'd followed Jennifer's advice to keep my head down and do good work, hoping that eventually my contributions would be recognized and rewarded. But today's humiliation had shattered that hope. Marcus hadn't just criticized my work. He'd dismissed it as fundamentally inadequate, amateur-hour thinking from someone who didn't understand the real requirements of professional architecture. He'd taken away the one project that had given my job meaning and reassigned it to someone he trusted to deliver reliable results. The message was clear: I wasn't reliable. My ideas weren't practical. My passion was a problem that needed to be managed, not an asset that should be cultivated. By 5:30, the office had emptied except for a few senior staff working late on urgent deadlines. I stayed at my desk, staring at my computer screen and trying to summon the energy to drive home to my tiny apartment and pretend that tomorrow would be different. My phone buzzed with a text from my roommate asking if I wanted to grab dinner, but I wasn't ready to explain what had happened or pretend that everything was fine. I wasn't ready to hear advice about staying positive or suggestions for looking on the bright side. I just wanted to sit in the empty office and feel sorry for myself for a few more minutes. The cleaning crew arrived around 6, wheeling their carts through the workspace and emptying trash cans with efficient indifference to the career dramas that played out in these cubicles every day. Maria, who'd been cleaning the building for years, nodded hello as she worked her way toward my corner. "Working late again, Mija?" she asked in accented English, pausing to empty my wastebasket. "Something like that." She studied my face with the perceptive eyes of someone who'd seen plenty of office heartbreak over the years. "Bad day?" I laughed, but it came out hollow and bitter. "You could say that. My grandmother used to say that the darkest hour comes before the sunrise," Maria said, wiping down my desk with practiced efficiency. Maybe tomorrow brings something better. Maybe, I replied, though I couldn't imagine what that something might be. After Maria moved on to the next cubicle, I finally gathered my things and headed for the elevator. The parking garage was mostly empty, my footsteps echoing off concrete walls as I walked toward my small Honda Civic, tucked between two oversized SUVs that probably cost more than I made in a year. The drive home took me through downtown Seattle, past construction sites, where other architects' visions were taking shape in steel and glass. I wondered if any of those buildings had been designed by women who'd been told their work was amateur. I wondered if any of those architects had kept their heads down long enough to earn the right to dream big. My apartment was a studio in Capitol Hill, chosen for its affordability rather than its charm. The space was too small for a proper drafting table, so I'd converted my dining area into a makeshift home office where I worked on personal projects and freelance side jobs. The walls were covered with sketches and photos of buildings I admired, architecture that inspired me to keep believing in the power of good design. Tonight, those images felt like mockery. Rem Koolhaas and Zaha Hadid and Frank Gehry stared down at me from their frames. Architects who'd revolutionized their field through vision and persistence and talent. They probably never had supervisors who called their work amateur hour. They probably never had to keep their heads down and prove themselves slowly. Or maybe they had. Maybe every architect faced moments like this. Moments when their dreams felt naive and their passion felt foolish and their talent felt insufficient. Maybe the difference between success and failure wasn't avoiding those moments, but surviving them with enough determination to keep trying. I heated up leftover Chinese takeout and sat on my small couch, scrolling through architecture websites and job listings with half-hearted interest. Other firms were hiring, but most of the openings required more experience than I had, or offered starting positions that wouldn't be much different from my current situation. The real problem wasn't finding another job. The real problem was figuring out whether Marcus was right about my abilities, whether my work really was amateur and impractical and expensive fantasy. Maybe I'd been overestimating my skills and underestimating the complexity of professional practice. Maybe my professors had been too kind, and my grades had been too generous, and my confidence had been built on foundations as unstable as a building designed without proper engineering. But then I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez and her excitement about the community garden. I thought about the affordable housing research I'd compiled, the sustainability studies that proved green building materials were cost-effective long-term investments, the innovative structural solutions that maximize space while minimizing environmental impact. That work wasn't amateur. It was thoughtful, informed, and creative. It was exactly the kind of architecture I'd gone to school to learn, the kind of practice I dreamed of building my career around. Marcus might have more experience, but experience didn't automatically equal wisdom. Authority didn't always mean expertise. Sometimes the people in charge were just people in charge, not because they were the most qualified or the most visionary, but because they'd been there longer, or played politics better, or fit the traditional image of what an architect should look like. I finished my dinner and pulled out my laptop, opening the files for my Riverside development designs. Marcus had called them amateur hour, but looking at them now, I saw something different. I saw months of careful research translated into innovative solutions. I saw sustainable design principles applied with both environmental consciousness and economic practicality. I saw architecture that served people instead of just impressing other architects. Maybe Marcus was wrong, maybe my work wasn't amateur at all. Maybe it was just different from what he expected, more ambitious than what he was comfortable with, more idealistic than what he thought clients would accept. Maybe the problem wasn't my abilities. Maybe the problem was working for someone who saw innovation as a threat instead of an opportunity. I spent the next 2 hours refining my Riverside designs, incorporating new ideas and strengthening the research that supported my material choices and spatial arrangements. Not because anyone had asked me to, but because the work itself still felt important and meaningful and right. Tomorrow, David would take over the project and probably strip away everything that made it special. He'd choose conventional materials and standard layouts and safe design choices that met minimum requirements without aspiring to anything exceptional. The community would get another generic mixed-use development instead of the thoughtful, sustainable neighborhood hub I'd envisioned. But tonight, for a few hours, I could pretend that my ideas still mattered. I could lose myself in the creative process that had first drawn me to architecture, the satisfaction of solving complex problems through design and research and innovative thinking. When I finally closed my laptop and went to bed, I felt something I hadn't expected after such a devastating day. I felt determined. Not to keep my head down or prove myself slowly, but to find a way to do the work I believed in, even if it meant leaving Richardson and Associates behind. Marcus might have taken away my project, but he couldn't take away my skills or my vision or my commitment to meaningful architecture. Those belonged to me, and I was starting to realize they might be worth more than any job that required me to diminish them. The last thing I thought about before falling asleep was Mrs. Rodriguez's voice on the phone, disappointed but still hopeful that the new architect would care about her community's needs. She deserved better than generic development. They all did. And maybe, somehow, I could find a way to give it to them. 3 weeks after Marcus stripped me of the Riverside project, I found myself standing in the supply closet at 7 a.m, crying over a box of printer paper like it held the secrets to my ruined career. The tears had been building for days, hiding behind professional smiles and polite nods during meetings where David presented my research as his own brilliant insights. Watching him take credit for the community engagement strategies I'd developed had been like watching someone else wear my clothes while pretending I didn't exist. The supply closet door opened suddenly and I turned away quickly, wiping my face with the back of my hand and pretending to count reams of copy paper. I expected Jennifer or maybe one of the interns, someone I could deflect with a casual comment about early morning productivity. Instead, I heard the unmistakable clicking of expensive heels against linoleum flooring. Emma Chen, isn't it? The voice belonged to Victoria Sterling, the firm's founding partner and a legend in sustainable architecture. I'd seen her exactly 3 times in my 6 months at the company, always from a distance during all-hands meetings or client presentations. She never spoke to junior staff directly, leaving that responsibility to supervisors and department heads. I turned around slowly, hoping my face didn't show evidence of my breakdown. Victoria was smaller than she appeared in conference rooms, maybe 5'4" in her designer heels, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent 30 years building buildings that changed skylines. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfectly executed chignon, and her charcoal suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. Yes, Miss Sterling. I was just restocking the drafting supplies. She studied my face with sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. At 7 a.m? Before anyone else arrives at the office? I felt heat crawling up my neck again, that familiar flush of embarrassment at being caught in a vulnerable moment. I like to get an early start on the day, in the supply closet. Sometimes I need to think clearly, and the office can be distracting. Victoria stepped fully into the small space and closed the door behind her, creating an intimacy that made me nervous. The closet suddenly felt even smaller with both of us inside, shelves of office supplies towering around us like witnesses to whatever conversation was about to unfold. "I've been watching you," she said without preamble. "Your work on the Henderson Community Center caught my attention. Innovative use of recycled materials, excellent integration of natural lighting systems." That wasn't Marcus's design aesthetic. My stomach dropped. If Victoria knew I'd been responsible for elements of that project, she probably also knew that Marcus had taken credit for them during his presentation to the board. The Henderson Center had been my first real contribution to a major project, a chance to implement sustainable design principles that would reduce operating costs while creating a healthier environment for community activities. "I assisted with some of the research," I said carefully, unsure how much I should reveal about my actual contributions. "Assisted?" Victoria repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Is that what we're calling architectural innovation now? Assistance?" She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. My name was written on the tab in precise handwriting. "I make it my business to know who's really responsible for the work that comes out of this firm. The Henderson Center's sustainable features saved the client $40,000 in the first year alone. Those weren't Marcus's ideas." The folder contained copies of my original design proposals, complete with my digital signatures and timestamps. Somehow, Victoria had access to files I thought only Marcus could see. She'd been tracking my contributions while I assumed no one in leadership noticed or cared about junior staff innovations. I also know about the Riverside Development Project, she continued. The preliminary designs that Marcus presented to our client last week were significantly different from your original proposals. Less community-focused, more conventionally profitable. The client was disappointed. My heart started beating faster. Disappointed? They hired us specifically because of our reputation for sustainable community development. They expected innovation, not standard mixed-use templates with green building certification stickers slapped on as an afterthought. Victoria opened the folder and showed me copies of emails between the client and Marcus, messages I'd never seen before. The client had specifically requested revisions that would incorporate more community spaces and affordable housing options. Marcus had responded that those features weren't economically viable, that the original budget required more conventional approaches. The client is reconsidering their contract with us, Victoria said quietly. $2.8 million in revenue, potentially lost because someone decided that innovative design was too risky for our firm's reputation. I stared at the emails, trying to process what I was seeing. The client wanted exactly what I'd proposed in my original designs. The community gardens, the affordable housing units, the sustainable materials that would reduce long-term operating costs. Everything Marcus had dismissed as amateur hour thinking was precisely what the client had hired us to provide. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Victoria closed the folder and met my eyes directly. "Because I'm tired of watching talented architects get buried under mediocre management. Because this firm was built on innovation and risk-taking, not safe choices and conventional thinking. Because you're exactly the kind of architect we need more of, not fewer of." The supply closet suddenly felt airless. I'd spent 6 months believing that my approaches were too idealistic, too expensive, too impractical for real-world applications. Marcus had convinced me that my ideas needed to be tempered by experience, that my passion needed to be channeled into more realistic directions. But Victoria was telling me the opposite. She was saying that my innovation was valuable, that my ideas were exactly what clients expected from Richardson and Associates. "Marcus has been with us for 8 years, Victoria continued. "He's competent, reliable, and completely risk-averse. He delivers projects on time and on budget, which has value. But he's also stifling the creative culture that made this firm successful. Young architects leave because they feel unheard. Clients choose other firms because they want innovation, not predictability." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Marcus's approach to managing talent is costing us money and reputation. I'm saying that your original Riverside designs were exactly what our client wanted to see. And I'm saying that it's time to fix this situation before we lose both the contract and the architect." Victoria reached into her briefcase again and pulled out a business card, elegant cream-colored cardstock with embossed lettering. "My direct email and phone number. I want you to send me your original Riverside proposals, all of them. Every design document, every research report, every community engagement summary. I'm presenting an alternative vision to the client on Friday. But Marcus is the project manager. He won't appreciate me going around him." "Marcus won't know until after the client meeting. And by then, it won't matter what he appreciates." I took the business card with trembling fingers, the expensive paper feeling substantial and real in my hand. Victoria Sterling's personal contact information represented possibilities I'd never imagined, opportunities that seemed too good to be true after weeks of professional humiliation. "There's something else," Victoria said, her voice dropping even lower. "I'm considering structural changes in our project management hierarchy. Changes that would create opportunities for architects who understand that innovation and profitability aren't mutually exclusive. Are you interested in being part of that conversation?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The supply closet that had felt like a hiding place 5 minutes ago now felt like the center of my professional universe, the place where my career might finally begin moving in the direction I'd always hoped it would go. "Send me those files by tomorrow evening," Victoria said, opening the door and stepping back into the hallway. "And Emma, stop hiding in supply closets. You're too talented to waste time feeling sorry for yourself." She walked away with the same confident stride that had brought her into my breakdown, leaving me standing alone among the printer paper and toner cartridges with a business card that felt like a lifeline and a head full of possibilities I didn't dare believe yet. The rest of that morning passed in a surreal haze of normal office routines, overlaid with secret excitement. I sat through Marcus's department meeting, listening to him outline project timelines and budget allocations, while knowing that Victoria Sterling was planning to undermine his authority in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate. I nodded appropriately when he discussed the Riverside project's progress, even though I knew the client was dissatisfied with the direction he'd taken my original designs. David presented updates on his version of the community development, explaining how he'd streamlined my plans to focus on maximizing rental income and minimizing construction costs. The affordable housing units had been reduced from 30% of total units to 15%. The community garden had been replaced with additional parking. The sustainable building materials had been swapped for conventional alternatives that met minimum green building standards without exceeding budget requirements. "The client seems pleased with our practical approach," David reported, though his tone suggested less confidence than his words implied. "They appreciate our focus on economic viability over idealistic features that might not generate adequate returns." I bit my tongue to keep from mentioning Victoria's revelation about client dissatisfaction. Instead, I took careful notes about all the changes David had made, documenting how each modification moved the project further away from the innovative community development the client had originally requested. After the meeting, I returned to my cubicle and opened the files Victoria had requested. My original Riverside designs looked even better than I remembered. Comprehensive solutions to complex urban planning challenges that balanced community needs with financial sustainability. The affordable housing units weren't just cheaper alternatives to market-rate apartments. They were thoughtfully designed homes with adequate space, natural light, and private outdoor areas that would provide dignity and stability for working families. The community spaces weren't luxury amenities that increased rent prices. They were practical investments in neighborhood cohesion, places where residents could build relationships and support networks that would improve quality of life for everyone in the development. The sustainable materials weren't expensive green building theater. They were cost-effective long-term investments that would reduce utility bills and maintenance costs while minimizing environmental impact. Every design choice had been researched, justified, and optimized for both community benefit and economic viability. These weren't amateur-hour fantasies. They were sophisticated architectural solutions that addressed real social problems while generating reasonable profits for developers. I spent my lunch break in the parking garage, sitting in my car and calling Mrs. Rodriguez to ask about her experience with David's team. The conversation confirmed what Victoria had suggested about client dissatisfaction. "He seems very focused on costs," Mrs. Rodriguez said diplomatically, "which I understand is important. But some of the features we discussed with you, the things that would really help our community, they're not priorities for him." "What kind of features?" "The community garden spaces, the affordable housing ratio, the small business support in the commercial areas. He says those ideas are too complicated for the budget we're working with. He wants to keep things simple and profitable." Simple and profitable. Exactly the approach Marcus had praised during department meetings, the reliable results that delivered adequate returns without aspiring to anything exceptional or meaningful. "Has anyone from the firm's senior management talked to your organization recently?" I asked. "Actually, yes. A woman called yesterday, Victoria something. She wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss our original vision for the project. She said the firm was reconsidering some of the design approaches." My heart started racing again. Victoria was already moving forward with her plan to present alternative designs to the client. She was rebuilding the community relationships that David had apparently neglected, reconnecting with the stakeholders who understood what the project could become if it prioritized innovation over convention. "Did she mention when this meeting might happen?" "Friday afternoon. She said she'd have some new proposals to show us, designs that might better match what we'd hoped for." Friday. The same day Victoria had mentioned presenting to the client. She was orchestrating a complete reversal of Marcus's project management, going directly to both the paying client and the community stakeholders to demonstrate that Richardson and Associates could still deliver the innovative architecture they'd originally expected. I spent the afternoon compiling everything Victoria had requested, organizing my files into a comprehensive presentation that told the complete story of the Riverside Development Project. My original research, my design proposals, my community engagement documentation, and my analysis of how David's changes had moved the project away from both client expectations and community needs. The work felt different this time, charged with purpose and possibility instead of the futile exercise in creative expression I'd been engaging in alone at home. Someone with real authority was taking my ideas seriously, someone who understood that innovation and profitability could work together if approached thoughtfully and strategically. By 5 o'clock, I had a portfolio that represented everything I believed architecture could accomplish when practiced with vision and social consciousness. The designs weren't just technically competent. They were emotionally intelligent, environmentally responsible, and economically sustainable. They were proof that young architects could contribute meaningful innovation to complex projects, that fresh perspectives could solve problems that conventional approaches couldn't address. I stayed late to perfect the presentation, refining details and strengthening arguments until every element of my proposal felt bulletproof. The office emptied around me, but I barely noticed the isolation. I was too focused on the possibility that tomorrow might mark the beginning of a completely different trajectory for my career. At 8 o'clock, Marcus appeared at my cubicle with the expression of someone who'd been looking for me. "Emma, you're here late. Everything okay?" "Just catching up on some project documentation," I replied, minimizing the windows on my computer screen. "Trying to stay on top of deadlines. Good initiative. That's the kind of dedication that gets noticed around here." His tone carried the patronizing warmth of a supervisor pleased with an employee's willingness to work unpaid overtime. "What project are you documenting?" "Site survey reports for the Morrison expansion. Making sure all the measurements and specifications are properly recorded." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Attention to detail is crucial for junior staff. It's how you build the foundation for more complex responsibilities later in your career." Later in your career. Always later, always conditional on proving myself worthy of trust and opportunity. Always dependent on satisfying Marcus's assessment of my readiness for real architectural work. "I should probably head home soon," I said. "Long day tomorrow." "Actually, that's why I wanted to talk to you. I've been reviewing your recent work, and I think you're ready for some additional responsibilities. Nothing too advanced, of course, but perhaps some client communication and project coordination tasks." The irony was overwhelming. Marcus was offering me expanded responsibilities at the exact moment Victoria Sterling was planning to demonstrate how thoroughly he'd mismanaged the most important project of the year. He was dangling the possibility of meaningful work while completely unaware that his authority was about to be undermined by someone who actually valued innovation over reliability. "That sounds interesting," I managed to say. "What kind of responsibilities?" "David could use some support on the Riverside project. The client has been asking detailed questions about materials and sustainability features, and your research background would be helpful for preparing responses." "I thought you said my work on that project was amateur hour." Marcus's expression shifted slightly, confusion flickering across his features like he couldn't quite remember saying something so deliberately cruel. "I may have been overly critical during that presentation. Sometimes I push hard because I want to see how junior staff respond to pressure. It's a teaching technique. A teaching technique." My public humiliation had been a learning opportunity, designed to help me grow as an architect by destroying my confidence and taking away my most meaningful project. Marcus was rewriting history in real time, transforming his cruelty into mentorship and my suffering into professional development. "I appreciate the feedback," I said carefully. "Constructive criticism is always valuable." "Exactly. And now you're ready to apply what you've learned to support David's team. I think you'll find the experience educational." Educational. Supporting David while he presented my research as his own insights would certainly be educational, though probably not in the way Marcus intended. I'd learn about office politics and power dynamics and the difference between being right and being heard. Should I start tomorrow? Monday would be fine. David will brief you on the client's latest requests, and you can begin preparing materials for his review. Marcus gathered his briefcase and checked his phone. It's good to see you taking initiative, Emma. This is exactly the kind of attitude that leads to advancement opportunities. After Marcus left, I sat in my cubicle for another hour, staring at my computer screen and trying to process the surreal conversation. He was offering me the chance to support the project he'd taken away from me, to provide research assistance for designs that had originally been my ideas. He seemed genuinely convinced that this represented career advancement, that supporting David's bastardized version of my work would be an educational opportunity I should appreciate. Maybe he really didn't understand what he'd done to me. Maybe his dismissal of my original designs had been genuine professional judgment rather than deliberate cruelty. Maybe he truly believed that his management style was effective mentorship, that breaking down junior staff before building them back up was a legitimate teaching approach. Or maybe he was just excellent at convincing himself that his actions were justified, that his treatment of subordinates was necessary and appropriate and beneficial for their long-term development. Maybe he'd spent years perfecting the art of professional gaslighting, making people doubt their own perceptions while positioning himself as a wise authority figure guiding their growth. It didn't matter anymore. Tomorrow evening, Victoria Sterling would receive my complete portfolio, and Friday afternoon, she'd present my original vision to clients who were already dissatisfied with conventional approaches. Marcus's authority would be revealed as inadequate, his judgment as flawed, his management style as counterproductive to both innovation and profitability. I finished organizing my files and encrypted them for secure email transmission. The portfolio represented 6 months of work, research, and creative development that Marcus had dismissed as amateur thinking. Victoria would soon discover whether that assessment was accurate, or whether the real amateur was the supervisor who couldn't recognize talent when it was sitting in front of him. The drive home took me past the proposed Riverside development site, an empty lot surrounded by established neighborhoods that could benefit from thoughtful mixed-use development. I pulled over and sat in my car, looking at the space and imagining what it could become if Victoria's plan succeeded. Community gardens where families could grow fresh food and build relationships with their neighbors. Affordable housing units that provided dignity and stability instead of just cheap shelter. Commercial spaces designed to support local businesses rather than national chains. Sustainable building systems that reduced environmental impact while lowering operating costs for residents. Architecture that served people instead of just generating profits for developers. Buildings that strengthened communities instead of disrupting them. Design that solved social problems instead of creating new ones. That was the vision Marcus had called amateur hour. That was the innovation David had stripped away in favor of conventional approaches. That was the meaningful work I'd been trained to do and passionate about accomplishing. Tomorrow, I'd find out whether Victoria Sterling was serious about supporting architects who believed buildings could change the world, or whether her encouragement was just another form of professional manipulation designed to extract more unpaid labor from idealistic young staff. But tonight, I allowed myself to hope that someone with real authority finally understood what I'd been trying to accomplish, that my ideas were valuable enough to fight for, that my career might finally begin moving in the direction I'd always believed it should go. The empty lot held so much possibility, so much potential for positive change if approached with vision and courage and commitment to something more meaningful than minimum acceptable results. Marcus saw complications and risks where I saw opportunities and solutions. David saw budget constraints where I saw creative challenges. Victoria Sterling, I hoped, saw the same potential I did. In 2 days, I'd know whether that hope was justified or whether I'd been setting myself up for another devastating disappointment in a career that had already provided more than enough of those. I drove home slowly, taking the long route through neighborhoods where other architects' visions had become reality in brick and steel and glass. Some buildings inspired me with their innovation and thoughtfulness. Others depressed me with their mediocrity and missed opportunities. All of them reminded me that every structure started as someone's idea, someone's belief that they could solve problems and create beauty and improve lives through design. Tomorrow, my ideas would either join that legacy or remain forever trapped in digital files and frustrated dreams. The difference would depend on whether Victoria Sterling was the mentor I desperately needed, or just another authority figure who talked about innovation while rewarding conformity. Either way, I was done hiding in supply closets and accepting diminished versions of my own vision. I was done keeping my head down and proving myself slowly to supervisors who saw my passion as a liability instead of an asset. It was time to find out what happened when young architects refused to accept that their ideas didn't matter, when they demanded the opportunity to do work that aligned with their values and training and dreams for what architecture could accomplish in the world. The worst that could happen was another humiliation, another dismissal, another reminder that idealism and innovation were unwelcome complications in a profession that rewarded reliability over creativity. I'd survived that disappointment before, and I could survive it again if necessary. But the best that could happen was the chance to build the career I'd always imagined, working with people who understood that architecture mattered, that buildings could solve problems, that design decisions could change lives in positive and meaningful ways. Friday afternoon would determine which future awaited me. Thursday morning arrived with the weight of conspiracy settling heavy on my shoulders. I had sent Victoria my complete portfolio the night before, watching the encrypted files upload with a mixture of excitement and terror that made my hands shake against the keyboard. Now there was no turning back. In less than 24 hours, she would present my original Riverside designs to clients who had specifically requested the innovation Marcus claimed they wouldn't want. The office felt different as I walked through the familiar corridors, like I was seeing everything through new eyes that understood the true power dynamics beneath the surface of professional courtesy. Marcus greeted me with his usual patronizing smile, completely unaware that his authority was about to be challenged by someone whose opinion actually mattered to the firm's bottom line. "Emma, perfect timing," he said, catching me near the elevator bank. "I had David pull together some background materials for your new support role on Riverside. He'll be expecting you in conference room B at 9. I nodded politely, clutching my coffee cup to hide the tremor in my fingers, looking forward to contributing to the project. That's the spirit. Initiative and team cooperation. Those are the qualities that build successful careers here. Conference room B was smaller than the boardroom where Marcus had humiliated me 3 weeks earlier, equipped with a round table that was supposed to encourage collaborative discussion. David had already arranged files across the surface when I arrived, thick folders labeled with client names and project timelines that represented his version of my stolen work. "Emma, glad you're joining the team," David said with the artificial enthusiasm of someone performing inclusivity for an audience of supervisors. "I know Marcus spoke with you about providing research support for client communications." "Yes, he mentioned the client has been asking detailed questions about materials and sustainability features." David's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "They've been quite persistent about certain elements that weren't included in our final proposal. Community features, affordable housing ratios, that sort of thing. We need comprehensive responses that explain why our current approach is more practical and economically viable." More practical and economically viable. Translation: help me justify why we removed all the innovative elements that made this project worth doing. David needed me to provide academic credibility for decisions that prioritized profit margins over community impact, to transform my original vision into ammunition against itself. What specific questions have they raised? Here's their latest email, David said, sliding a printed document across the table. They're asking for detailed analysis of alternative approaches to affordable housing integration. They want to understand why we reduced the percentage from 30 to 15% of total units. I read through the client's message, recognizing the language of developers who understood that meaningful community development required more than cosmetic gestures towards social responsibility. They weren't questioning the affordable housing reduction because they wanted to spend more money unnecessarily. They were questioning it because they'd hired Richardson and Associates specifically for our reputation in creating sustainable, inclusive developments. They also want comparative cost analysis for the sustainable building materials we eliminated, David continued. They're asking why we chose conventional alternatives when our initial proposal emphasized long-term operational savings from green building systems. Every question the client had raised went directly to the heart of what I'd spent months researching and documenting. They wanted explanations for decisions that couldn't be properly explained because those decisions had been based on Marcus's preference for conventional approaches rather than actual analysis of costs, benefits, and community needs. Do we have documentation of the decision-making process that led to these changes? I asked. David shifted uncomfortably. The revisions were based on standard industry practices and budget optimization recommendations from our senior management team. Standard industry practices. Budget optimization. Corporate euphemisms for abandoning innovation in favor of approaches that guaranteed adequate profits without aspiring to exceptional results. David was asking me to provide academic justification for decisions that had been made without academic rigor, to defend choices that contradicted everything I'd learned about sustainable community development. I'll need to review the original research and proposal documents to provide comprehensive responses, I said. What files do you have available? Marcus has the preliminary materials. I've been working primarily with the revised proposals that reflect our final approach. The revised proposals that reflected Marcus's complete abandonment of community-focused design in favor of conventional mixed-use development with green building stickers. David didn't have access to my original research because he'd never needed to understand the thinking behind the features he'd eliminated. He'd simply been told to maximize rental income and minimize construction costs, standard instructions that required no innovation or social consciousness. I should probably review those preliminary materials to understand the full scope of what the client is asking about. Actually, Marcus suggested it might be more efficient for you to focus on forward-looking analysis rather than dwelling on preliminary concepts that didn't make it into our final proposal. Forward-looking analysis that ignored the foundation of research and community engagement that had informed my original designs. Marcus wanted me to provide responses to client questions without referencing the work that would have answered those questions comprehensively and convincingly. He was asking me to defend inferior decisions without acknowledging that superior alternatives had ever existed. I understand the preference for forward-looking analysis, I said carefully. But the client's questions seem to reference specific elements from our initial discussions with them. It might be helpful to understand what expectations were set during those early conversations. David's discomfort became more obvious. The initial discussions were handled primarily by Marcus and the senior team. My involvement began when the project moved into final development phase. Translation. David had been brought in to implement conventional solutions after I'd been removed from meaningful participation. He was defending decisions he hadn't made, justifying approaches he hadn't designed, explaining away innovation he'd never fully understood. No wonder the client was dissatisfied with responses that couldn't address their actual concerns. Let me start by reviewing the client's questions in detail, I said. I'll prepare some preliminary research and analysis that we can discuss before drafting formal responses. Sounds good. Marcus wants draft responses by Monday morning, so we'll need to move quickly. After David left, I sat alone in conference room B, surrounded by files that represented the sanitized version of my stolen project. Every folder contained evidence of how conventional thinking had diminished ambitious plans, how risk-averse management had transformed community development into profit optimization, how my months of research had been discarded in favor of industry-standard approaches that solved no problems and inspired no one. The client's questions weren't difficult to answer. They were impossible to answer honestly without acknowledging that Richardson and Associates had abandoned the innovative approach we'd originally promised them. They wanted to know why we'd reduced affordable housing, eliminated community spaces, and replaced sustainable materials with conventional alternatives. The real answer was that Marcus preferred predictable results over meaningful innovation, but that wasn't the kind of response David could send to a client who'd hired us specifically for our reputation in sustainable community development. I spent the morning researching comparable projects and industry studies that might provide professional justification for the changes David needed to defend. The work felt like intellectual prostitution, using my academic training to rationalize decisions that contradicted everything I believed about responsible architecture. But it also provided valuable insight into exactly what Victoria would need to demonstrate when she presented my original designs to the client tomorrow. Every piece of research I compiled for David's defense made my original approach look more compelling by comparison. Studies showed that affordable housing integration actually increased property values when executed thoughtfully. Analysis proved that sustainable building materials generated long-term savings that more than offset higher upfront costs. Case studies demonstrated that community spaces strengthened neighborhood cohesion in ways that benefited all residents, not just low-income families. The evidence overwhelmingly supported the innovative approaches Marcus had dismissed as amateur-hour thinking. The client's questions weren't unreasonable requests for expensive complications. They were informed inquiries from developers who understood that exceptional projects required exceptional design, that meaningful community development couldn't be achieved through minimum viable approaches. By lunchtime, I had compiled enough research to answer the client's questions both ways. I could provide the defensive responses David needed to justify conventional decisions, or I could provide the comprehensive analysis that would validate my original innovative approaches. The difference was whether Richardson and Associates wanted to admit that we'd abandoned our stated commitments to sustainable community development in favor of easier, more profitable alternatives. I ate my sandwich in the small park across from our building, watching construction workers laying foundation for another generic office complex that would contribute nothing to the neighborhood except traffic congestion and higher rent prices. The building would meet all required codes and generate adequate returns for investors, but it would solve no problems and create no beauty and inspire no one to believe that architecture could make the world better. That was the kind of reliable result Marcus preferred, the kind of predictable outcome that minimized risk while maximizing conventional success. Safe choices that guaranteed mediocre results, instead of ambitious choices that might generate exceptional impact or spectacular failure. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Coffee shop across from your office. 20 minutes. Important update. VS Victoria Sterling wanted to meet, presumably to discuss tomorrow's client presentation and whatever role she expected me to play in undermining Marcus's authority. I finished my sandwich quickly and walked across the street to Grind Coffee, a small independent shop that served the kind of carefully sourced beans that cost more than most junior architects could afford. Victoria was sitting at a corner table, dressed in a navy blazer that managed to look both professional and approachable. She'd chosen a location where we could speak privately without office gossip or corporate surveillance, neutral ground where honest conversation might be possible. "Emma, thank you for meeting on short notice," she said as I approached her table. "I wanted to discuss tomorrow's presentation before we move forward. Have you had a chance to review the materials I sent? I spent most of last night going through your portfolio." Exceptional work. Exactly what our client expected when they hired us. Victoria's expression was serious, but not grim, focused rather than worried. "Your original designs solve every problem they've raised in their recent communications with David's team." Marcus was convinced the client wouldn't want those features. Too expensive, too complicated, too idealistic for real-world development. Marcus was wrong. Our client specifically chose Richardson and Associates because of our reputation for innovative community development. They could have hired any number of firms to deliver conventional mixed-use projects. They came to us because they wanted something better. Victoria pulled out her tablet and showed me an email chain I'd never seen, correspondence between Richardson and Associates and the client that went back to the initial proposal phase. The client had explicitly requested sustainable materials, affordable housing integration, and community spaces that would serve existing neighborhood residents rather than displacing them. These requirements were clearly stated in our original contract, Victoria said. Marcus chose to interpret them as suggestions rather than specifications. David's team has been trying to explain away contractual commitments instead of fulfilling them. The email chain revealed a pattern of miscommunication and misdirection that went far beyond simple professional disagreement. The client had been asking for specific features that I'd included in my original designs, while Marcus and David had been providing excuses for why those features weren't practical or necessary. "Tomorrow's meeting is our opportunity to get this project back on track," Victoria continued. "I'll be presenting your original designs as alternative approaches that better fulfill the client's stated requirements. I want you there to answer technical questions and explain the research that supports your material choices and spatial arrangements." "What about Marcus?" He's the project manager. Marcus will be invited to attend as a courtesy. This is a senior leadership initiative to ensure client satisfaction, not a commentary on his management capabilities. Victoria's tone suggested that it was definitely a commentary on Marcus's management capabilities, but one that would be framed diplomatically to minimize workplace drama. How should I prepare for the meeting? Be ready to explain your design decisions in terms of cost-benefit analysis and long-term value creation. This client understands that innovative approaches require upfront investment, but they want to see clear evidence that the investment will generate returns in operational savings, community impact, and property value enhancement. Victoria handed me a folder containing additional research she'd compiled, studies from similar projects that had successfully implemented the sustainable and community-focused features I'd proposed for Riverside. The documentation was comprehensive and professionally presented, the kind of support I'd never received from Marcus when he was dismissing my ideas as amateur-hour thinking. I also want you to understand that this meeting represents more than just one project, Victoria said. I've been planning some structural changes in our firm's approach to project management and talent development. Changes that would create new opportunities for architects who understand that innovation and profitability can work together. What kind of structural changes? A new position focused on sustainable community development, reporting directly to senior management rather than through department supervisors. Someone who could work across projects to ensure that our designs fulfill both client expectations and social responsibility commitments. The position she was describing sounded like everything I'd hoped my career at Richardson & Associates would become. Meaningful work on projects that mattered, authority to implement innovative solutions, direct connection to decision-makers who valued sustainable community development rather than just conventional profit maximization. That sounds like an incredible opportunity. It would be, for the right person. Someone with the technical skills to design sustainable systems, the research background to justify innovative approaches, and the communication abilities to work effectively with both clients and community stakeholders. Victoria was describing qualifications that matched my education, experience, and demonstrated capabilities exactly. She was offering me the chance to bypass Marcus's obstructive management entirely, to work directly with senior leadership on projects that aligned with my values and training. Tomorrow's meeting will be something of an audition, she continued. If your presentation goes well, if the client responds positively to your original designs, it will demonstrate that you're ready for increased responsibilities and direct client interaction. An audition. The client meeting that I'd been nervous about was actually an opportunity to prove that I could handle the kind of work I'd been trained to do, that my ideas were valuable enough to deserve serious consideration from both clients and senior management. What if the client doesn't respond positively? What if Marcus's approach was right about their preferences? Then we'll know that this client isn't the right fit for Richardson & Associates' stated mission of innovative community development. But I don't think that's going to happen. Your designs solve exactly the problems they've been asking us to address. Victoria finished her coffee and gathered her materials. One more thing. This stays between us until after tomorrow's meeting. Marcus and David need to attend the presentation without advance notice of what we'll be proposing. I want their authentic reactions to your work, not prepared responses to defend their alternative approaches. Understood. Excellent. Meeting is at 2:00 in the main conference room. Bring copies of all your original research and be prepared to discuss any aspect of your designs in detail. After Victoria left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, trying to process the magnitude of what was about to happen. Tomorrow afternoon, my original Riverside designs would be presented to the client who'd been dissatisfied with conventional alternatives. My research would be used to answer questions that David couldn't address convincingly. My vision for sustainable community development would be evaluated by people who had the authority to make it reality. Marcus would discover that his dismissal of my work had been professionally damaging rather than pedagogically helpful. David would learn that his conventional approaches had failed to satisfy client requirements. The entire project management hierarchy that had marginalized my contributions would be revealed as counterproductive to both innovation and profitability. The possibility of professional vindication was intoxicating, but it came with risks that scared me almost as much as the opportunity excited me. If Victoria's plan failed, if the client rejected my designs, if Marcus successfully defended his conventional approaches, my career at Richardson & Associates would be effectively over. I couldn't survive another public humiliation, another dismissal of my ideas as amateur hour thinking. But if Victoria's plan succeeded, if the client embraced my original vision, if senior management recognized the value of innovative community development, everything would change. My work would finally be valued appropriately. My ideas would have the support they needed to become reality. My career would move in the direction I'd always believed it should go. The afternoon dragged as I pretended to work on David's defensive responses while actually preparing for tomorrow's presentation. I reviewed every detail of my original designs, strengthened arguments for sustainable materials, and compiled additional research that would support community-focused development approaches. The work felt completely different this time, charged with purpose and possibility instead of futile creative expression. Someone with real authority was taking my ideas seriously. Someone who understood that exceptional projects required exceptional design. Someone who valued innovation over reliability. By 5 o'clock, I had everything I needed to defend my original vision comprehensively and convincingly. The research was thorough, the cost-benefit analysis was compelling, and the design solutions addressed every concern the client had raised about David's conventional alternatives. Marcus stopped by my cubicle as I was packing up, his expression carrying the satisfied authority of someone whose day had proceeded according to plan. "How's the client response preparation coming along?" "Making good progress. The research is quite comprehensive." "Excellent." David mentioned that the client's questions were fairly detailed, but I'm confident we can provide satisfactory explanations for our design decisions. Our design decisions. Marcus was claiming ownership of approaches he'd imposed over my objections, conventional solutions that had created the client dissatisfaction he was now trying to resolve. Tomorrow he'd discover that his confident predictions about client preferences had been completely wrong, that his dismissal of my innovative approaches had been professionally damaging rather than wisely cautious. "I'm sure we can address their concerns effectively," I said. "That's the spirit." Sometimes clients need help understanding why certain approaches are more practical than their initial expectations. It's part of our job to guide them toward realistic solutions. Realistic solutions that abandoned innovation in favor of conventional approaches that solved no problems and inspired no one. Marcus genuinely believed that his role was to lower client expectations rather than exceed them, to convince developers that meaningful community development was impractical rather than essential. Tomorrow, Victoria Sterling would demonstrate the difference between guidance that elevated projects and guidance that diminished them, between management that supported innovation and management that stifled it, between leadership that valued exceptional results and leadership that settled for adequate ones. I drove home through neighborhoods where other architects had chosen between conventional safety and innovative ambition, between reliable mediocrity and exceptional impact. Some buildings inspired hope for what architecture could accomplish when practiced with vision and courage. Others reminded me of opportunities missed, problems unsolved, communities underserved by professionals who prioritized their own comfort over their clients' needs. Tomorrow, I'd find out which category my own work belonged in, whether my ideas were strong enough to survive scrutiny from people who understood the difference between innovation and fantasy, whether my research could support the weight of professional expectations and client requirements. The Riverside development site looked different as I drove past it on my way home, charged with possibility instead of marked by disappointment. If Victoria's plan succeeded, that empty lot would become the community-focused development I'd originally envisioned. The kind of place where families could build real lives instead of just surviving, where local businesses could thrive instead of being displaced by national chains. Architecture that served people instead of just generating profits for developers. Buildings that strengthened communities instead of disrupting them. Design that solved social problems instead of creating new ones. That was the vision Marcus had called amateur hour, the innovation David had stripped away in favor of conventional approaches, the meaningful work I'd been trained to do and passionate about accomplishing. In less than 20 hours, I'd know whether that vision was valuable enough to defend, whether my ideas were strong enough to change minds, whether my research could transform skepticism into support for approaches that prioritized community impact over profit maximization. The worst that could happen was another humiliation, another confirmation that idealism and innovation were unwelcome complications in a profession that rewarded conformity over creativity. I'd survived that disappointment before, and I could survive it again if necessary. But the best that could happen was the validation I'd been seeking for 6 months. Proof that my work was exactly what clients wanted when they hired Richardson and Associates for sustainable community development. Evidence that Marcus's conventional wisdom was actually professional negligence, disguised as cautious management. Tomorrow afternoon would determine which future awaited me, which version of my career would become reality, which understanding of architecture and community and social responsibility would guide the next phase of my professional development. I fell asleep reviewing my research and dreaming of buildings that could change the world, architecture that solved problems instead of creating them, communities that thrived instead of merely surviving the developments imposed upon them by people who confused profit margins with professional success. Friday morning would arrive with questions that had waited 6 months for proper answers, opportunities that had been delayed by supervisors who mistook innovation for inexperience, possibilities that had been suppressed by management that valued predictability over meaningful impact. Whatever happened in tomorrow's meeting, I was done accepting diminished versions of my own vision, done keeping quiet about ideas that could improve people's lives, done pretending that conventional approaches were adequate, when exceptional alternatives were available to anyone willing to research them thoroughly and implement them courageously. It was time to find out what happened when young architects refused to accept that their ideas didn't matter, when they demanded the opportunity to do work that aligned with their values and training and dreams for what architecture could accomplish in a world that desperately needed buildings designed by people who cared about more than minimum acceptable results. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp Seattle air that made everything feel possible. Sunlight streaming through the conference room windows as I arranged my presentation materials on the polished table. Victoria had already set up her laptop and projector, transforming the space where I'd been humiliated 3 weeks earlier into the stage for what might be my professional redemption, or my final devastating failure. The client team arrived promptly at 2 o'clock, 3 representatives from Meridian Development, who carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to making decisions that shaped entire neighborhoods. James Harrison, the project director, was a tall man in his 50s, whose handshake felt firm and genuine. Sarah Kim, their sustainability coordinator, looked to be about my age, with the sharp focus of someone who understood that environmental responsibility required more than good intentions. Robert Chen, their community liaison, had the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent years navigating the complex politics of urban development. Marcus entered behind them with David at his side, both men carrying folders and expressions of professional confidence that would soon be tested in ways they couldn't anticipate. Marcus had dressed carefully for the meeting, his expensive suit and perfectly arranged tie projecting the authority of someone who believed his position protected him from serious challenge. "Thank you all for making time on short notice," Victoria began, taking her position at the head of the table with the natural command presence that had built Richardson and Associates into one of Seattle's most respected architectural firms. "I wanted to discuss some alternative approaches to the Riverside development that might better address your recent concerns about community integration and sustainability features." James Harrison leaned forward with interest. "We appreciate your responsiveness to our feedback. The current proposal meets basic requirements, but we were hoping for something more innovative, more aligned with the vision we outlined in our original request." "That's exactly what we're here to discuss," Victoria replied, gesturing toward me. "Emma Chen, one of our most talented sustainable design specialists, has developed some compelling alternatives that I think you'll find address your concerns comprehensively." Most talented sustainable design specialists. The introduction was generous and strategic, positioning me as an expert rather than the junior staff member who'd been relegated to coffee service and basic drafting. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly at Victoria's description, confusion flickering across his features as he tried to reconcile this presentation with his understanding of office hierarchy. I stood and activated the projector, my original Riverside designs filling the screen with the community-focused vision that Marcus had dismissed as amateur hour thinking. The affordable housing units, the community gardens, the sustainable building systems, the small business spaces designed to serve existing neighborhood residents rather than displacing them. Our alternative approach prioritizes long-term community impact alongside financial sustainability, I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected despite the magnitude of what was happening. The design integrates 30% affordable housing units while maintaining market-rate profitability through operational savings from sustainable building systems. Sarah Kim immediately pulled out her notebook, copying down statistics as I explained how solar installations, rainwater collection, and energy-efficient building materials would reduce operating costs by enough to offset the revenue difference between affordable and market-rate units. These aren't theoretical savings, I continued, clicking to a slide that showed comparable projects in Portland and San Francisco. Similar developments have documented operational cost reductions of 25 to 35% within the first 5 years, creating financial sustainability that supports affordable housing integration without requiring ongoing subsidies. Robert Chen raised his hand. What about community spaces? The current proposal eliminated most of the gathering areas and the community garden that we discussed in our initial meetings. Our alternative design includes 1,500 square feet of community space on the ground floor, I replied, advancing to architectural plans that showed the layout Marcus had rejected. The community garden occupies the central courtyard, providing food security resources while creating natural gathering spaces that encourage neighbor interaction and social cohesion. I clicked through detailed renderings of the garden spaces, showing how raised beds and fruit trees would be integrated with children's play areas and adult gathering spaces. The design wasn't decorative landscaping. It was a comprehensive food security initiative that could reduce grocery costs for low-income families, while creating opportunities for community building across economic and cultural divides. James Harrison studied the images with growing enthusiasm. This is much closer to what we had in mind. The community focus aligns with our development philosophy, but we need to understand the financial implications. What's the impact on construction costs and projected returns? Victoria nodded toward me to continue, her expression reflecting satisfaction with how the presentation was proceeding. Marcus and David sat silently, their prepared materials suddenly irrelevant to a conversation that had moved far beyond defending conventional decisions. The sustainable building materials add approximately 12% to upfront construction costs, I explained, showing detailed cost analysis that I'd spent months researching and refining. However, operational savings from reduced energy consumption, water usage, and maintenance requirements generate full cost recovery within 7 years, followed by ongoing savings that improve long-term profitability. Sarah Kim looked up from her notes. What about LEED certification? The current proposal only meets basic green building standards. Our alternative design achieves LEED Platinum certification, which qualifies for municipal tax incentives that offset approximately 40% of the additional sustainable material costs, I replied. The combination of tax benefits and operational savings creates a compelling financial case for choosing innovative approaches over conventional alternatives. The room had transformed completely since I'd begun speaking. The client representatives were engaged and excited, asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and material specifications. Victoria was documenting their responses and concerns, clearly pleased with how my presentation was addressing their dissatisfaction with David's conventional approach. Marcus finally found his voice. These are interesting concepts, but I'm concerned about the complexity of managing so many innovative features simultaneously. Our current approach prioritizes reliable delivery over experimental techniques that might create unexpected challenges. Actually, James Harrison interjected, complexity is exactly what we're looking for. We chose Richardson & Associates specifically because of your reputation for innovative community development. We could have hired any number of firms to deliver standard, mixed-use projects. The comment landed like a physical blow to Marcus's professional confidence. His face flushed as he realized that his preference for conventional approaches had been undermining the client relationship rather than protecting it, that his dismissal of my innovative designs had been professionally damaging rather than wisely cautious. Emma's research addresses every concern you've raised in your recent communications, Victoria added, her tone diplomatically neutral but clearly supportive of my alternative approach. The affordable housing integration, the community spaces, The sustainable building systems that you specifically requested in your original contract. Robert Chen nodded enthusiastically. This is exactly the kind of thinking we expected. The current proposal felt like a generic development with sustainability stickers, not the meaningful community investment we want to create. David shifted uncomfortably as the client's criticism of his work became increasingly explicit. His conventional alternatives weren't just different from my original designs. They were inferior solutions that failed to meet client expectations and contractual requirements. Could we see more detail about the commercial spaces? Sarah Kim asked. We're particularly interested in how the design supports local businesses versus national chain stores. I advanced to floor plans that showed the ground-level commercial areas, explaining how the space configurations and lease structures were designed to accommodate small, locally owned businesses, rather than large retail chains that could afford higher rents but provided fewer community benefits. The commercial spaces range from 800 to 1,500 square feet, ideal for restaurants, bookstores, service businesses, and artisan shops that serve neighborhood residents, I explained. Lease terms include percentage rent options that allow small businesses to establish themselves without prohibitive upfront costs. James Harrison was taking notes now, clearly impressed with the level of detail and community focus that my designs provided. This addresses one of our major concerns about gentrification. We want development that strengthens existing communities rather than displacing them. The design also includes live work units that provide affordable housing for artists and small business owners, I continued, showing apartment layouts that integrated residential and commercial space. This creates opportunities for entrepreneur families to build equity while contributing to neighborhood economic diversity. The presentation continued for another 40 minutes, with client representatives asking increasingly detailed questions about implementation, timelines, and material specifications. Every question revealed how thoroughly I'd researched sustainable community development, how carefully I'd considered the balance between innovation and practical feasibility. Marcus and David contributed almost nothing to the discussion, their expertise in conventional approaches suddenly irrelevant to a conversation about innovative solutions that exceeded client expectations, rather than managing them downward. They sat silently as I answered technical questions with confidence and precision, demonstrating the professional competence that Marcus had dismissed as amateur hour thinking. This is outstanding work, James Harrison said finally, closing his notebook and looking directly at Victoria. This alternative approach addresses every concern we've raised about the current proposal. When can we see revised contracts that reflect these design changes? I'll have our legal team prepare updated agreements by Monday morning, Victoria replied. Emma will serve as the primary design coordinator to ensure that implementation reflects the vision she's presented today. Primary design coordinator. The role that should have been mine from the beginning. The responsibility that Marcus had dismissed as too advanced for someone with my experience level. Victoria was publicly recognizing my expertise while positioning me as the client's main point of contact for the project. Marcus looked stunned, his authority undermined so completely that he seemed unable to formulate any response. David stared at the conference table, probably calculating how this development would affect his own career prospects at a firm that clearly valued innovation over conventional reliability. There's one more thing I'd like to discuss, Victoria continued, her tone becoming more formal as she transitioned to what felt like prepared remarks. Richardson and Associates is implementing some structural changes in our approach to sustainable community development. We're creating a new position focused specifically on innovative project coordination, reporting directly to senior management. She looked at me directly. Emma, I'd like to offer you the role of Director of Sustainable Community Development, effective immediately. The position includes project management authority, direct client interaction, and oversight of all community-focused development initiatives. Director of Sustainable Community Development. The title represented everything I'd hoped my career could become, everything Marcus had told me I wasn't qualified to pursue, everything I dreamed of accomplishing when I'd first chosen architecture as my profession. I'd be honored to accept, I managed to say, my voice barely steady enough to sound professional. James Harrison smiled broadly. Congratulations, Emma. We're looking forward to working with you on this project, and hopefully many others in the future. The client team gathered their materials and headed toward the door, their satisfaction with the meeting obvious in their animated conversation about implementation timelines and community outreach strategies. They paused to shake hands with Victoria and me, confirming Monday meetings to finalize contract revisions. After they left, the conference room fell silent, except for the humming of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of Friday afternoon office activity. Marcus and David remained seated, both men apparently struggling to process how completely their authority had been undermined by a junior staff member they'd dismissed as inexperienced and idealistic. "Marcus," Victoria said, her tone shifting to the serious diplomacy required for uncomfortable personnel conversations. "I think we need to discuss some adjustments to project management responsibilities going forward." Marcus nodded slowly, his confident professional demeanor replaced by the uncertain expression of someone whose competence had been publicly questioned. "I understand that the client's preferences were different than I anticipated." "The client's preferences were clearly stated in their original contract," Victoria replied. "The issue isn't anticipation. The issue is implementation of contractual commitments that were abandoned in favor of conventional approaches." The criticism was diplomatically phrased but devastatingly accurate. Marcus had failed to deliver what the client had specifically requested, choosing instead to impose his own preferences for predictable results over innovative solutions. His judgment had been professionally wrong, his authority counterproductive to both client satisfaction and firm profitability. "I think it would be best if I took some time to consider my options," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who understood that his career at Richardson & Associates had reached an inflection point. "That might be wise," Victoria agreed. "David, I'd like you to work with Emma on transitioning the Riverside project documentation. She'll need complete access to all files and client communications." David nodded mechanically, probably relieved that his own role in the conventional approach wouldn't be scrutinized as harshly as Marcus's management decisions. He was a competent architect who'd followed instructions from a supervisor whose judgment had proved inadequate. His career could recover from this setback if he learned to value innovation over reliability. After Marcus and David left, Victoria and I remained in the conference room, surrounded by the presentation materials that had transformed my professional prospects in less than 2 hours. The designs that Marcus had called amateur hour thinking had impressed clients who understood the difference between innovation and fantasy. Research that had been dismissed as impractical had provided practical solutions to complex community development challenges. "You handled that beautifully," Victoria said, beginning to pack up her laptop. "Professional, confident, and thoroughly prepared. Exactly the kind of presentation skills we need for client-facing positions. Thank you for creating this opportunity. I know it required significant risk on your part." The only risk was continuing to let Marcus's management style damage our client relationships and suppress innovation from talented staff members. What happened today was long overdue. Victoria finished gathering her materials and headed toward the door, pausing to deliver what felt like final guidance for my new role. "Monday morning, we'll discuss your team assignments and project budget authority. You'll have administrative support, direct access to senior management, and the resources you need to implement the kind of community-focused development that distinguishes Richardson & Associates from conventional firms." After she left, I sat alone in the conference room where my career had been destroyed 3 weeks earlier and reborn this afternoon. The space looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed completely. My ideas were valued instead of dismissed. My research was respected instead of ignored. My vision for sustainable community development was supported instead of suppressed. The Riverside project would proceed according to my original designs, creating affordable housing and community spaces that served existing neighborhood residents rather than displacing them. The sustainable building systems would reduce environmental impact while generating long-term operational savings. The local business spaces would strengthen economic diversity instead of contributing to gentrification. Architecture that served people instead of just generating profits for developers. Buildings that strengthened communities instead of disrupting them. Design that solved social problems instead of creating new ones. That was the work I'd been trained to do, the career I'd always believed was possible, the meaningful impact I'd hoped to accomplish through thoughtful architecture and community engagement. Marcus had told me those goals were amateur hour thinking, that my ideas needed to be tempered by experience and practical limitations. Today, clients who understood the difference between innovation and fantasy had embraced my original vision enthusiastically, proving that meaningful community development wasn't idealistic dreaming, but practical problem-solving that required research, creativity, and commitment to something more important than minimum acceptable results. I walked back to my cubicle to gather personal belongings, past colleagues who were probably already discussing the afternoon's dramatic events through office gossip networks that transmitted news faster than official communications. Some faces showed curiosity. Others reflected the cautious calculations of people trying to position themselves favorably with changing power dynamics. Jennifer appeared at my desk as I was packing my few personal items into a small box. "Emma, I heard about your promotion. Congratulations, that's amazing news." "Thank you. It's been quite a day." "I have to ask, how did this happen so quickly? 3 weeks ago, Marcus was criticizing your work in front of everyone. Now you're suddenly a director with client management responsibilities." I looked at Jennifer directly, remembering her advice to keep my head down and prove myself slowly. Her suggestion that Marcus's treatment of me was just paying dues that everyone had to endure. Sometimes keeping your head down isn't the best strategy. Sometimes you have to advocate for your ideas, even when supervisors tell you they're not good enough. "But how did Victoria Sterling even know about your work? She doesn't usually get involved in junior staff projects." "She made it her business to know. Turns out senior management pays more attention to innovation than I realized." Jennifer's expression shifted as she processed the implications of what I was telling her. If Victoria had been monitoring my contributions while Marcus was dismissing them, if my work had been valued by people with real authority while being suppressed by middle management, then perhaps the office hierarchy wasn't as fixed as it appeared. Are there going to be other changes? Other opportunities for people who've been overlooked? I think Victoria is interested in supporting architects who prioritize innovation over conventional approaches. People who care more about meaningful work than safe career moves. I finished packing my personal items and headed toward the elevator, leaving behind the cubicle where I'd spent 6 months feeling invisible and undervalued. Monday morning, I'd returned to a corner office with a view of Elliott Bay, project management authority, and the resources I needed to implement sustainable community development that made real differences in people's lives. The drive home took me past the Riverside Development site one final time. The empty lot that would soon become the community-focused development I'd originally envisioned. Affordable housing for working families, community gardens that provided food security and social connection, commercial spaces designed to support local businesses rather than national chains. Mrs. Rodriguez would get her community garden after all. Mr. Thompson would see commercial spaces that prioritized local entrepreneurs over chain stores. The neighborhood would gain 300 new residents without losing its character or displacing existing families. That evening, I called my parents to share news of the promotion, trying to explain how dramatically my career prospects had changed in a single afternoon. My mother, who'd worried about my choice to pursue architecture instead of more stable professions, seemed amazed that idealism and professional success could align so completely. "Your grandmother always said that good work eventually gets recognized," she told me. Maybe she was right after all. Good work eventually gets recognized, but only if you're brave enough to advocate for it when authority figures tell you it's not valuable. Only if you refuse to accept diminished versions of your own vision. Only if you believe that meaningful work is worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible to win. Monday morning would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to prove that architecture could solve social problems while generating reasonable profits for developers. I'd have administrative support, project budget authority, and direct access to senior management that valued innovation over conventional reliability. Most importantly, I'd have the chance to work with clients who understood that exceptional projects required exceptional design, that meaningful community development couldn't be achieved through minimum viable approaches, that buildings could change lives if designed by people who cared about more than minimum acceptable results. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had told me that I wasn't qualified for real work, that my ideas were amateur hour thinking that needed to be managed by supervisors with better judgment. Today, clients who paid millions of dollars for professional expertise had enthusiastically embraced my original vision, proving that the real amateur was the manager who couldn't recognize talent when it was sitting in front of him. Tomorrow, I'd begin implementing the kind of sustainable community development that had drawn me to architecture in the first place, working with people who understood that innovation and profitability could work together if approached with vision, research, and commitment to something more meaningful than reliable mediocrity. The empty lot would become a thriving community. The affordable housing units would provide dignity and stability for working families. The sustainable building systems would reduce environmental impact while generating long-term operational savings. Architecture that served people instead of just impressing other architects. Buildings that strengthened communities instead of disrupting them. Design that solved social problems instead of creating new ones. That was the work I'd been trained to do, the career I'd always believed was possible, the meaningful impact I'd finally been given the authority to accomplish. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.